The phrase I hear most often in a courtroom is simple. It wasn't me. People blame traffic lights, bad weather, misunderstandings, other people, bad luck, anything except themselves. Most spend their entire hearing trying to escape responsibility, but there was one morning I will never forget. Not because of shouting, not because of chaos, because of 4 quiet words spoken by a man who looked completely defeated by life. 4 words that silenced an entire courtroom in seconds. It was my fault. His name was Thomas. No last name listed on the original booking paperwork, just Thomas. Homeless, no permanent address. The charges against him were serious enough to bring him before the court: vandalism, destruction of property, disorderly conduct. According to the police report, Thomas had thrown a brick through the front window of Sal's Market at around 2 in the morning. But what caught my attention wasn't the broken glass. It was what happened after. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He sat calmly on the curb beside the shattered window and waited for the police to arrive. When officers pulled up, he immediately held out his hands for handcuffs and quietly admitted, "It was my fault." That detail stayed with me. People who commit crimes in the middle of the night usually flee the scene. They panic. They make excuses. Thomas did none of those things. Before entering the courtroom that morning, I watched the store's security footage myself. Rain poured heavily outside while Thomas paced back and forth in front of the market for nearly 10 minutes. He didn't look angry. He didn't appear drunk. He looked desperate, completely desperate. Finally, he picked up a loose brick from a nearby construction pile, paused for a moment with his eyes closed, and threw it through the glass. The alarm exploded through the night. But Thomas never entered the store. He never stole a single thing. Instead, he sat down on the cold, wet pavement, wrapped his arms around his knees, and waited to be arrested. The moment Thomas entered my courtroom, the atmosphere changed. He looked exhausted in a way that goes beyond lack of sleep. His oversized coat was falling apart, held together with duct tape and safety pins. His shoes didn't even match, but despite his condition, there was still dignity in the way he carried himself. He didn't stare at the floor like most defendants. He looked directly at me with tired but clear eyes. Nearby stood Officer Miller, the veteran officer who arrested him. Even Miller looked confused by the entire situation. He wasn't angry. He looked like a man trying to understand something that didn't make sense. When the clerk announced the case, Thomas stepped forward immediately. He didn't wait for an attorney. He didn't ask for explanations. He leaned toward the microphone and calmly confessed again. "It was my fault, Your Honor. I broke the window. I did it on purpose. I'm guilty." Usually, judges spend half the hearing trying to uncover the truth. But Thomas handed it over immediately, and somehow that honesty made the situation feel even heavier. I explained the charges and asked if he understood them. Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, he understood. Yes, he threw the brick. Yes, he waited for the officer. Officer Miller confirmed every detail. He explained how strange the arrest felt. Normally, officers chase suspects through alleyways or neighborhoods. Thomas waved the officer over before he even stepped out of the patrol car. He cooperated fully. He practically surrendered himself. That's when I asked the question that mattered most. Why? Why break the window? Why wait to be arrested? Why deliberately commit a crime? Thomas stared down at his damaged shoes for several long seconds while the courtroom waited in silence. Then he looked up and quietly answered, "It was cold, Your Honor." He explained that the temperature that night had dropped dangerously low. The wind coming off the water cut straight through his thin coat. He tried every shelter he knew. Every single one was full. The church basement was packed before evening even arrived. He spent hours sitting alone in an alley trying to stay awake. Then something terrifying happened. He stopped shivering, and according to Thomas, that was the moment fear truly hit him. Because when your body stops shivering in weather like that, sometimes you never wake up again. That's when I realized what this case really was. Thomas hadn't broken the window out of anger. He broke it because he believed it was the only way to survive the night. He explained it plainly. If he triggered the alarm, police would arrive. They would arrest him. The jail holding cell would be warm. They would give him food and a blanket. He traded his freedom for heat because the alternative was freezing to death alone outside. The entire courtroom fell quiet after that. Officer Miller looked down at his boots because he already understood the truth. He hadn't arrested a violent criminal that night. He arrested a man begging for survival. Thomas admitted what he did was wrong, but he also admitted he felt he had no other option. He even explained that he chose Sal's Market because the owner had shown him kindness before by giving him coffee. Thomas waited at the scene because he wanted Sal to know who broke the window so he could someday repay him. I looked deeper into Thomas's background. No prior arrests, no history of violence, no disturbances. He was 62 years old. That kind of record told me this wasn't a career criminal, so I asked him what happened. Slowly the story began unfolding. For 30 years Thomas worked as a machinist at a textile plant until the company shut down. He had a wife named Sarah. They had a home, a normal life. Then Sarah became seriously ill with cancer. Insurance refused to cover experimental treatments, but Thomas refused to stop trying to save her. They sold their house, emptied savings accounts, maxed out credit cards. He spent every dollar he had trying to keep her alive. In the end, he lost everything, including Sarah. After she died, Thomas simply drifted through life with nothing left. The tragedy sat heavily in the courtroom. This wasn't a man who spent his life causing trouble. This was a husband who sacrificed everything for the woman he loved and ended up abandoned by the very system he spent decades contributing to. Thomas stubbornly repeated that he was still guilty because he broke the law. He didn't want pity. He only wanted the truth heard. Then I called forward Sal Moretti, the owner of the market whose window had been destroyed. Sal originally came to court expecting repayment for the damages. But as he listened to Thomas speak, his expression changed completely. Standing just feet away from the man who broke his window, Sal admitted he had seen Thomas around the neighborhood for years. Thomas never caused problems. Sometimes he even swept the sidewalk outside the store without being asked. Sal simply didn't realize how desperate his situation had become. Thomas immediately promised he would repay every dollar somehow. He explained he still had skills. He could work. He could repair things. He didn't want charity. But before he could continue, Sal shook his head. The insurance would cover most of the damage. Looking at Thomas now, Sal said the man had already suffered enough. He didn't want restitution anymore. It was an extraordinary act of mercy. Thomas looked stunned. The courtroom collectively exhaled as tension disappeared for the first time all morning. But despite Sal forgiving the debt, there was still a legal problem. Thomas had committed a crime. And if I dismissed the case immediately, he would walk straight back into freezing temperatures with nowhere safe to go. That's when the terrible paradox became clear. Freedom, Thomas's situation, might actually kill him. Thomas admitted it openly. Snow was coming that night. He begged for 30 days in county jail because jail at least guaranteed warmth, blankets, and food. Imagine hearing a man plead for prison, not out of fear of punishment, but because incarceration felt safer than freedom. Officer Miller then raised another painful reality. If Thomas received a criminal record, he could lose access to housing programs and future opportunities permanently. Sending him to jail might save him for one night while destroying any chance of rebuilding his life afterward. But releasing him risked sending him back into deadly conditions. It felt like a trap with no humane solution. I removed my glasses and sat there, thinking carefully, because I knew there had to be another option. A solution that didn't involve either a jail cell or a funeral. Finally, I told Thomas I would not send him to prison because he wasn't a criminal. He was a man in crisis. Thomas panicked immediately, terrified he was being forced back onto the street. But before he could continue, I reached beneath the bench and pulled out my personal checkbook. The entire courtroom froze. Officer Miller looked stunned. In decades of law enforcement, he had never seen a judge reach for a personal checkbook during criminal proceedings. I wrote a check for $500 to a modest local motel called the Traveler's Inn. Then I handed it to Officer Miller and instructed him to personally drive Thomas there after court. The check would cover several weeks of a warm room, hot showers, and meals. Thomas immediately tried refusing the help. He insisted he couldn't accept charity. He worked his entire life and didn't want handouts. That's when I explained the truth to him. It wasn't charity. It was an investment. An investment in a man who still had skills, dignity, and the ability to rebuild if someone simply gave him enough time to breathe. I told him the deal clearly. 2 weeks of warmth and stability in exchange for using that time to rebuild his life properly. Thomas couldn't even speak afterward. Tears rolled down his face while years of exhaustion and hopelessness finally seemed to crack apart. Then Sal stepped forward again with another surprise. He offered Thomas part-time work at the market beginning the very next morning, repair work, shelving, maintenance, cash payment until Thomas could get back on his feet properly. The reaction inside the courtroom was emotional and immediate. Thomas stared at Sal in disbelief. The same man whose window he destroyed was now offering him employment. Sal simply shrugged and admitted he remembered what it felt like to struggle. All he asked was for Thomas to show up on time the next morning. At that moment, the courtroom stopped feeling like a place of punishment. It became something else entirely, a place where people chose restoration over destruction. But before leaving, Thomas reached into his worn coat pocket and removed the only valuable thing he still owned, a small silver locket that belonged to his late wife, Sarah. He offered it to me as collateral for the money. Inside the locket was a faded photograph of Sarah and a small lock of hair. Thomas explained he kept it with him every single night. It was the one possession he refused to sell while trying to survive. But he insisted on leaving it with the court because he needed to feel like he was entering an agreement, not begging for pity. I realized accepting the locket wasn't about money. It was about preserving his dignity. So I agreed. I told him the locket would remain safely stored until he returned to court, standing on his own feet again. When he came back with proof he rebuilt his life, he would get it back. Thomas nodded with visible relief. For the first time all morning, he looked hopeful instead of broken. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the case. $500 meant almost nothing to some people. But to Thomas, it represented survival. The next morning, Officer Miller met me before court and told me something incredible. Thomas arrived at Sal's market 30 minutes early. He was already cleaning the broken glass before work even began. He had showered, shaved. Sal found him proper boots to wear. Officer Miller said Thomas no longer looked like a suspect. He looked like a citizen again. 3 weeks later, Thomas returned for his status hearing. I barely recognized him. Clean clothes, proper haircut, work boots, confidence. Beside him stood Sal and Officer Miller, both smiling proudly. Thomas handed over proof of everything, motel records, pay stubs from Sal's market, and even a signed lease agreement for his own apartment. In just weeks, he transformed his entire life. Then Thomas did something nobody expected. He placed $500 on the courtroom railing, every dollar earned honestly through work. He wanted to repay the motel money, because he needed to reclaim the locket with dignity. He needed to prove to himself he wasn't surviving off charity anymore. When I returned Sarah's locket to him, Thomas placed it around his neck immediately and closed his eyes. He whispered that it finally felt like he had his wife back again. Everyone thought that was the emotional ending to the story. But then Officer Miller announced someone else wanted to speak. A young woman entered the courtroom, nervously searching the room until she saw Thomas standing there. The second their eyes met, both of them froze. "Dad," she whispered before running toward him. Thomas nearly collapsed from shock. It was his daughter, Jennifer, the daughter who spent years searching for him after losing contact when the house was foreclosed. Officer Miller explained that while processing Thomas weeks earlier, he discovered a missing person report filed by Jennifer years ago. He contacted her and invited her to court that morning. Jennifer tearfully explained she thought her father was dead. Thomas admitted he disappeared because shame consumed him after losing everything. He didn't want his daughter seeing him homeless and broken. Jennifer didn't care about the money or the house. She just wanted her father back. When she saw Sarah's locket around his neck, she broke down, crying again. Then she invited him home to live near her and finally meet his grandchildren properly. Thomas looked overwhelmed hearing that he still had family waiting for him after all these years. That's when I officially dismissed the charges. There was no criminal standing before me anymore, just a father who found his way home again. The entire courtroom erupted into applause as Thomas hugged Sal, shook Officer Miller's hand, and walked out beside his daughter, carrying a future he thought he lost forever. Later that evening, Officer Miller handed me an envelope Thomas left behind. Inside was a handwritten note and a single signed dollar bill. The first dollar Thomas earned fixing Sal's van. He wrote that he couldn't repay the kindness fully with money, so instead he promised to become the father and grandfather his family deserved. He promised not to waste the second chance he had been given. That signed dollar bill still hangs beside my law degree, not because of its financial value, but because of what it represents. Thomas walked into court believing his life was over. He walked out with dignity, work, family, and hope restored. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about recognizing when someone standing before you isn't trying to beat the system. They're simply trying to survive it.